Normally when you write about a crook is a crook is a crook. But in this case, this guy was very different. It wasn't your typical case of fraud. There was the great and inspiring educator, and there was the crook who took advantage of people.
So he's half Mr. Chips and half the guy from Catch Me If You Can.
It looked like he'd been hiding a big lie for a lot of his life and, it had all come crashing down.
I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Today we're going to talk to two of my colleagues, Genevieve, Alison and Ashley Argoon, about the very fascinating offences committed by a man called Neil Lennie. And Neil Lennie, listeners will remember, is the con man, the teacher, the fraudster, the hero, the villain who persuaded people for many years that he was a highly qualified teacher when in fact he wasn't highly qualified at all. Now, you two, I'm not sure who's going to answer this, but who the hell is Neil Lennie? Where did he come from?
Well, I suppose that's a good place to start.
This is Genevieve.
He was born in Sydney, but he actually spent a lot of his early life in the Persian Gulf. He had two parents who were also teachers. They were also Christian missionaries. He had three brothers, but about at the age of 9, he was shipped off to Haileybury College.
In Melbourne?
In Melbourne.
As a boarder?
As a boarder. So very young, 9 years old.
Poor little boy.
Sent across the world without his family. He graduated from Haileybury College and then he enrolled in university.
Which one?
Melbourne University in a science degree. But it was short-lived.
Why is that?
He flunked out in his first year. He failed.
Who hasn't?
He failed 3 out of 4 subjects, which is an automatic suspension.
Right.
Instead of going back to uni, he was scouted as let's call it a graduate teacher, an undergraduate teacher. So a lot of public schools back in the early 70s, they were in desperate need of teachers.
Yeah.
Emergency teachers. These are schools out in the burbs.
Yep.
And they had a short supply of teachers. So they went around to some of the universities and said, give us your undergraduates. They can get a couple of years work experience and then they can go back to uni and finish their degree. So Lennie was, after flunking, he still went on to some of those schools out in the burbs and he worked at those schools for a number of years. The problem was he never went back to university. Right. So he never got his degree. But what he did get was his dad's teaching registration.
Right. So the turning point in this story is at some point somebody didn't call him out on this and say, where's your bits of paper? And at some point he's been able to slip dad's registration into the pack. And how would you do that?
Well, instead you use your dad's registration, Keith Lennie.
Yeah.
You put your name in the middle, Keith Neil Lennie, and you use a certificate that says you were born in 1911.
And no one looked?
No one seemed to notice that, apparently. So he used this as a fake resume when he went to private schools. First private school he worked at was Mount Scopus Memorial College. Incredibly elite school in Melbourne. Very highly sought after, gets amazing grades every single year.
Yeah.
And he went armed with this fake resume and his dad's teaching registration and asked for a job. And he ended up getting it because they looked up the number on the registration. It said it was a verified teacher's registration. So, hey presto, here's a job for Neil Lennie and now he's on staff.
And once you're in the room, and this applies to any con, does it? Once you're in the room, having got your way into the committee room at the MCG or whatever, or, behind stage at the Rolling Stones concert, once you're there, it's sort of self-fulfilling.
Well, why would you keep checking as another employer and another employer? Why would you bother even checking when they've already had a job in an elite institution? You just think, oh, that makes sense. He's got his registration. There's a number. Give him another gig.
We all take everyone at face value. When we go to the doctor, we go, well, that's a doctor. We don't demand to see their qualifications. We assume rightly in 99% of the cases that the people we deal with, I believe that you two are qualified, hard-working journalists.
Not showing you my degree, Ruler.
No.
And you've got to remember,
but-
this is back in the 70s. So everything's on paper. Everything's hand filed. It's, written with a pen. It's not computerized. There's no, database that they can just key a number into to check. So they've got to rely on what people are saying. And Neil Lennie's a charming guy, All the people we've spoken to, he walked with an air of confidence, and he dressed, back in the 70s, the teachers at Mount Scopus, they were wearing shorts, long socks, sandals, right?
Right.
Not Lennie.
I remember this.
Lennie was wearing suits. He loved a flashy tie, straight suit. Everyone we've spoken to remembers how well dressed he was. So, you walk in, you got your dad's teaching registration, you're wearing a nice suit, you're acting with confidence. Who's going to question you?
Why did he not just turn 11 in 1911 to 41, and convert it, and then photocopy that document, and would he have been home and hosed had he had that sorted?
Did they have photocopiers in the late 60s? Not my era.
I think they had versions thereof.
Look, it's a great point, but I suppose the point is it wasn't a very sophisticated con.
No.
He's gone with a certificate that he did a little.
I'm trying to help him here. I'm trying to work out how he could have got away with it.
Yeah. Well,
you're sort of coppers, you two. You're very keen to trip him up. I think it's a wonderful con myself. But anyway,
it's one of those ones. It wasn't sophisticated to start with, and it was probably like he was what, early 20s at this point. So he's gone in with it, and he probably, a young 20-year-old male couldn't see the bigger picture, maybe couldn't see the future. He thought, I'll just tell this lie now. But as it got bigger and bigger, and he went to another school, and the decades passed, the judge said it herself. She said it became a really difficult lie to untell. How do you go back from it?
Good point. Once in what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive is a very true thing in all of life, and he was caught, whether he wanted to be or not.
Lady Macbeth said something like, methinks she doth protest too much. And that's a little bit of Lennie, because when he starts to get caught, he doesn't go quietly. He kicks up a stink, and that confidence, that bravado, he puts it back on the teaching watchdog, and he said, well, you lost my file. You find it. You prove I'm not a qualified teacher.
Good skills. Now, let's get to the heart of this. How did he get sprung? Where did it all unravel? How long did he teach for? How many thousand children did he influence and help?
So many. So many. So what we know from the court proceeding is that he taught at these elite schools from 1976 to the year 2000. But what we found out is that then he went up to set up his own private school that he became the principal of, and he ran that for about a decade, and it had, say, 100 students a year going to that as well.
Where was that?
That was in the middle of the CBD. It was called New Generation College. It was built up on 2 levels on Elizabeth Street in the old London Towers.
Yeah.
And students used to travel into the city. They'd press a button up the lift into the CBD building, sandwiched between office buildings.
Yeah.
And they would rock up to this school where there were some classrooms off to the side. And that school operated for about a decade before eventually it was, very rare case, shut down by the government for being a risk to student welfare.
In what sense was it a risk?
There were problems with students' grades. They didn't know where some of the students were even living. There were a lot of kids who came from overseas and may have been living in university lodgings or were supposed to be at homestay, but they didn't have any a lot of files were missing. They didn't have documents on where those kids were living or any contact details of them, which is a real concern when you've got kids flying in from India and Sri Lanka and China, and their parents expect these schools to be on top of them and checking in on their welfare. But what we've learned is that this school, it was a complete shambles, an absolute shambles. And a lot of kids weren't rocking up. They weren't rocking up to classes. Students had to sign in for attendance themselves. So this school ended up being shut down by what's called the VRQA, the school's watchdog, in 2015. And that's because it was considered such a problem for student well-being that they had no choice but to immediately close its doors. And so those students in the middle of a VCE year, it was a VCE specialist school, in the middle of the year, they were told your school doesn't exist anymore. Here's a list of other schools that you can pick, and you can go to another school nearby. You won't be coming here anymore. And a lot of those students still today have no idea why the school that they really loved, in some cases, was shut down. They weren't told back then. They still don't know now. And it's not until this podcast that we're really able to reveal why that happened.
Oh, I see. So there are deep, dark secrets that can be exposed.
There are.
And have been by diligent reporting. And we'll be back after this. Okay, what sort of person was he, Genevieve? What impression did he leave behind him? How did he treat people? What do they think of him?
Well, I guess it depends who you ask, because you're going to get a lot of different answers. So if you ask his students, which the court did, they asked for character references from his former students, they say that he was a brilliant teacher. He was the best they ever had. One of the most, impactful references was from Professor Sharon Lewin. She is one of our top scientists in the country.
We see her on the television.
Yeah, she's pretty prominent at the moment because she's dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, and pretty well. She wrote a letter to the court and said that, having Lennie as a teacher was like a gift, and he told her to shoot for the stars and encouraged her she could be anything she wanted to be.
At which school?
This was at Mount Scopus.
Right.
So his students loved him. They thought he was fantastic. But we've spoken to a lot of his colleagues, the teachers, and I suppose he was a different guy in the staff room than he was in the classroom. And we were saying about that confidence and that, pizzazz that he walked with in his suits. People that were spoken to say that he often looked down on you. He was a bit of a snob, which is ironic because he actually never finished university. And he loved his musical theatre, and everything was very performative. But if you crossed him, well, he was a bit of a bully.
Right, such as?
So at Mount Scopus, which we were speaking about before, he spent about 12 years there teaching young minds, moulding young minds. But it was a staffing issue that saw his end at that school. He got
fired. He was asked to leave.
We'll call a spade a spade. He was fired by the principal there at the time, and after he said, you'll finish out the term and then off you'll go, and that will be the end of it. So they have this big staff luncheon at the end of every school term, and teachers that are leaving for one reason or another are given a chance to get up and say a few words and say some parting words that they're going to leave their colleagues with, and most will say thank you, or I've had a great time teaching here my last 12 years. Lennie didn't do that. Lennie got up and he blasted the school, and he blasted the principal and his colleagues, and as it was said, he lit a match and he lit a river of gasoline.
That harmed him eventually?
Yes.
Oh, is that right? So he's the architect of his own destruction because he got so many people offside they decided to pursue him, or what?
I think it's that sense of hubris. He was,
Oh, good word.
He was, so sure of himself. And, perhaps by the end he did start to believe his own lies and that he felt that he was untouchable. So, he's been fired from Mount Scopus and he went down in a blaze of glory.
Right.
And he went on to his next school and his next school and his next school. And his final, I suppose, established school that he taught at was Over Newton College, which is out in Keilor, and it was an up and coming school at the time. But the interesting thing about Over Newton is that it's mostly run by parents. So parents are on the school board, they call the shots, they have all the power. And there was one, I suppose, parent information night, and they were talking about how the students were going to have to get compulsory laptops. All the parents had to buy them. And a parent put up their hand and said, well, what if I can't afford a laptop? And Lennie got up in his suit and he said, well, if you can't afford a laptop, you don't belong at a school like this. So there's that bravado coming through again, that little bit of snobbery.
Yes.
And from then on, the parents, said he's got to go.
Not a very sensible thing for any teacher to say in public, even if they say it in private.
Even if they're thinking it, you probably wouldn't say it.
No, you wouldn't.
But in terms of what he's like today, that's what he was like in the 70s, 80s and 90s. The Neil Lennie of today that we've tried to get to know is a foreboding figure. He's tall, he wears very nice suits. We see him in court in a big black overcoat. His hair is always gelled back. He always looks incredibly presentable.
What gave you the idea to do this? How did it come around?
So I'd actually been hearing Neil Lennie's name for about 5 years. I've been working on the education round. Yeah. And as part of the education round, I like to pursue dodgy teachers. There's a surprising lot of them, actually. There's about one teacher a week that gets suspended by the teaching watchdog, which is quite a lot. So I heard his name a bit because in 2015 he was actually done for a teaching offence. He'd given up his teaching registration in 2009 and said, I don't need it anymore. And in 2015, the teaching watchdog took him to court and said, you've still been teaching at your own private school. We know that, so we'll take you to court for that. And he ended up pleading guilty to unregistered teaching for 5 years. But what I'd been hearing from people involved in it was that actually it was so much more than a teaching offence. This was a fraud that ran for his entire career for about 50 years.
You heard this?
I'd been hearing this. And I'd been told, remember this guy's name. He's going to pop up again. And so I kept my eye on it. And then eventually I got a call. And it was just before the borders were shutting between Victoria and New South Wales for the coronavirus lockdown.
1 year ago.
Perfect timing. And I got told he's in court, he's facing court tomorrow. And here I was in a Chuka-Moama, stuck over the border with no way to get back. So I called my dear friend Genevieve, who works in courts, and said, can you get to this matter? And she went along that day and saw the first of Neil Lennie in court, outside Court 2, waiting for his matter, where he looked a lot more like a lawyer than he did an accused.
Right.
He was standing there with his baby-faced lawyer, very young guy. He looked like the senior associate that was standing there waiting for a matter with his junior.
Yeah.
Just looked like he did not belong in this place at all.
Unless as a judge or something.
Well, he's 72 years old. He probably looks a bit more fitting as a judge.
Yeah.
And he's got a really strong voice. Yeah. He's a big performer. And
very judge-like in my experience.
Incredibly judge-like. So we started following the case from there. And that court case was on the front page of the paper. Yeah. And after that, the emails just flooded in. And we were thinking, okay, not surprised, people always have a reaction to these things. But it was not the reaction we were expecting at all. All of the people contacting us said pretty much, leave this guy alone. He is an amazing teacher. He changed my life. He was so inspirational. And they were all defending him. And these people were barristers, they were
articulate,
doctors.
legitimate people, not just cranks who write silly letters to journalists.
These were incredibly intelligent, very high-profile people in our community.
Was that confusing for you? Did it sort of... could you work out where North was after that?
It made it so much more fascinating because normally when you write about a crook is a crook is a crook. But in this case, this guy was very different. It wasn't your typical case of fraud. And so it showed that there was two sides of perception of what a crime could be. Mm. And what we found out later is there was two faces to Lennie. There was the great and inspiring educator, and there was the crook who took advantage of people.
So he's half Mr. Chips and half the guy from Catch Me If You Can, Frank with the long name.
He's the new age Leonardo DiCaprio from Catch Me If You Can.
Melbourne's Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah. Jen, you covered those early cases, and you're a court reporter who's seen a lot of villains come and go. What was your impression of him in the way I presume he was cross-examined in front of you?
No, so he, as Ash said, he rocked up to court. It was like the middle of July, so it was freezing cold. He had his big overcoat on, umbrella, and he didn't have to say anything in court. It was a pretty, brief hearing when he first appeared, and our photographer, as they do, chased him down the street to get the money shot. And he kind of tried to duck and weave behind his young lawyer. And he had a look on his face, that he looked worlds away from this big, revered school leader that we'd been hearing about, because when Ash told me, she said, this guy was a principal. So I'm assuming, the guy that I saw, he looks like he could have been a principal. And, but, his face kind of gave it away. It looked like he'd been hiding a big lie for a lot of his life, and, it had all come crashing down. So
you can see the worry and the stress.
Yeah.
Etched into the face.
Yeah, I mean, he's 72. He's not a young sprout, but even from a couple of years ago, he'd appeared in a newspaper article where he'd been photographed, because that's one other thing Lennie loves to do. He loves the limelight. For a guy that's hiding such a big secret, he would do TV interviews. He would write letters to the editor. He would go on newspapers. He would go on morning TV. He put his face on billboards.
Doesn't that help, though? Does that not help the illusion?
Well, I suppose it does, because, newspapers were interviewing him as if he was the authority, because for all intents and purposes, he was. He was, a principal. He knew what he was talking about.
A lot of people listening to this, or some people listening to this, will say, well, what is a teacher? In the end, is not a teacher some part of the way they teach? If they've got the knowledge and they can do it, aren't they a teacher? In the sense that journalists are just people who do it. You don't really actually have to have a qualification. You just have to be able to do it. And you learn by imitation and repetition until you get better at it. And some people get better than others, and that's that. I would argue that there's a degree of truth in every profession about that. That's brain surgeons or beekeepers, they all learn by imitation and repetition on the job more than they learn at the beekeeper college or the brain surgery school. Is that an attitude you've come against in discussing this with people, and also in the correspondence you've had?
So not only have supporters of Lennie said to us, well, he was amazing as an educator, what's your beef? What's the problem here? We've had our own colleagues say to us, why are you pursuing this? What's the problem? It's just a piece of paper. Why does he need it? And I suppose our question back is, would you ask the same thing of a doctor? Would you ask the same thing of a pilot? Would you ask the same thing of the nurse that might be treating you in hospital when COVID comes around? Why is it that we assume teachers don't need a qualification, or that assumption might be there? And what we've heard from people who are in fierce argument that you do need those qualifications, you desperately need those qualifications, is that they set a standard, and that there has to be standards in our community. And if you don't have them, that's when chaos reigns. Yeah,
it is a fascinating thing, and you make a good philosophical point that in the end society relies on standards being met, and once we abandon that, it's a slippery slope, perhaps, although other difficult people would say, well, if you make one small slip in an aeroplane full of people, it could kill them all. One small slip in a classroom, such as not knowing who George Washington was, is not going to kill anybody.
We had one of his former students there, because I posed that question. I said, would you go to a doctor that was unqualified? And she's like, oh, that's ridiculous. No one ever died by not learning their long division properly. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. But I suppose there's so much trust put in schools. People send their kids there and they want to, well, they deserve to know that the people that are teaching them in those really formative years are who they say they are, and they're not deceiving people. And, this is something the judge kept going over, that she said that I really believe that, in my opinion, you were doing this because you wanted to teach. And what we've had people say in counter to that is that if he just wanted to teach, why didn't he do it for free? And why didn't he do it in some small school that really needed, someone as brilliant as him? Why did he have to do it in the top Melbourne schools? Why did he have to, be headmaster and deputy principal and rise to the top and have, open his own school and keep going up and up and up? If it was just about teaching, what was the motivation?
If it was altruism, he could go to Cambodia and
exactly
volunteer. Yeah.
The other issue, it's not just about him not being registered as a teacher. He used his reputation in his years at private schools when he wasn't supposed to be teaching. He used his reputation there as a platform to create his own private schools, where he ends up being the leader of those places, and he's meant to be setting standards. So if you've got someone who already cares not for the law, and they're the one who is employing other teachers and already having to ensure that children are safe, what does that mean for the places that he runs? And what we've come to learn is that the place that he did run was an absolute shambles.
That's interesting. It would appear to me that people who are aberrant, who break the rules, break laws, do the wrong thing, they tend to do it in all different ways. So the murderer is also a thief. Not every murderer, but people who rob banks will also shoplift something that's worth 50 cents, and it's brought them undone. It does happen because they're rule breakers. It's what they're like. Now, is there an example with Neil Lennie of this sort of carelessness for doing the right thing, that in other ways he had an aberrant, deviant personality? I don't mean a sexual deviant necessarily, any sort of deviation from normal behaviour.
Well, he called himself a doctor.
Did he? That was overreaching a bit, wasn't it?
He posed as Dr. Neil Lennie, and he used that title and other titles. There was about 10 degrees or so that he claimed to have when he was travelling the world trying to bring students to his private school. Dr. Neil Lennie, PhD, was the most prolific of them.
Magnificent.
And so he would stand there shaking hands with students in Sri Lanka with his tie and his pocket square, handing them golden pieces of paper that said, Dr. Neil Lennie, PhD, I've been principal of all of these places.
That really is proper con.
Travel to Australia, entrust your children, your high school children, to come across the world and be taught at my school. So he's legitimised himself as a doctor of education or a man with a PhD. And you trust someone like that. You think that they've spent years and years
That's
crafting.
the moment when he really, really stepped up and became a big-time con, because that is a wonderful effrontery and very dishonest. So you can, once you've done that, you can't go back and say, look, I was just a good player caught out of position. He really did go for it in a big way. So, in other words, you got him bang to rights. You've not wasted your time with this bloke. And we'll be back after this to finish our story. Well, it seems to me that depending who you are and which window you look through, that you're going to see Neil Lennie as a career teacher who's been dedicated to teaching thousands of people, most of whom seem to be pretty happy with the result, or quite legitimately you can see him as a career con man and potentially even a sinister figure in that he's willing to tell lie upon lie upon lie and to build bigger lies and bigger lies, such as, pretending that he's a PhD and so on. So, ladies, what is he? Is he a hero or is he a villain? Genevieve?
I say this to Ash every day, that I change my mind. And I think that's why it's such a fascinating story and case, is because I wake up one morning and I speak to people that he has breached their trust and lied to them and deceived them, or I speak to their family members that he's done the same thing to. And I go, yeah, he's an awful guy. Why does it matter that he was a great teacher? Why does that mean he should get away with it? But then other days you sit in court and you hear, our top scientists and doctors and barristers saying that he was the reason that they excelled. And how do you dismiss that? So I don't know the answer. I change my mind every day.
Hero and villain for you. Now,
why can't you do both?
Ashley Argoon,
Well,
hero or villain?
I think the question for me is, and it's what we asked throughout this whole thing, did he harm more people than he helped? Or did he inspire more people than he betrayed? Is he a hero or is he a villain?
What do the numbers say? The tail of the tape. How many did he harm? How many did he help? Do you think, roughly?
I think the jury's out, even though the judge's call is already in.
Yeah.
I think the jury's still out. And I think there's a lot of people we haven't heard from yet that he has harmed and that he's also helped. There's heaps more to this story and...
Lots of episodes of most riveting podcast, which will be called
Class Act.
That's so clever. Okay, pretend I'm a Herald Sun listener. How do I access your excellent podcast, Class Act, about the Neil Lennie saga?
Good question. The first episode is actually already out.
Right.
It's available for subscribers, so they can get on the Herald Sun website or the app. The second episode will be out tomorrow, Sunday, and then we'll have 2 episodes a week for the next few weeks. And for non-subscribers, it'll be available on iTunes and other platforms in due course.
That is excellent. Thanks for listening. Please comment or rate it on whatever platform you're using. And if you haven't done it already, please subscribe.